I hope you're doing well. My name's Matthew, and I post videos every Monday and Friday. So if you love the tingles, then hit that subscribe button because you are in the right place. Thank you to everyone who's recently subscribed and really loving the last video I've posted. I'm glad you're really enjoying it. If you've got any true crime suggestions that you want to hear, then leave them in the comments below. I shall add them to my list. I love doing your guys' suggestions, and yeah, I love making videos that you guys want to watch and you find relaxing and enjoyable. Now, today's case, we are going to be looking at the case of Matthew Millet, who turns out to be the great nephew of a serial killer called Ivan Millet. I think that's how you pronounce their last name. And Matthew was sentenced to 43 years in jail with a 30-year non-parole period for the brutal murder of 17-year-old David Occhialoni. His accomplice, Cohen Klein, was sentenced to 32 years in jail with a 22-year non-parole period. I think that's New South Wales Supreme Court, Justice Jane Matthews said in the last 10 minutes of his life the deceased was subject to almost inconceivable torment and torture by Millet. It is impossible to imagine the terror that the deceased was subjected to. It was thoroughly senseless and brutal murder. He took the life of an innocent young man who was unfortunate enough to be his friend in a completely brutal manner, simply for his own enjoyment. Having to regard the whole of the evidence, I consider Millet, with his personality disorder, to be at best a substantial risk and poses a serious potential danger to the community. I am unable to find that these are genuine expressions of remorse. In my view, they were written for forensic purposes only. In particular, the poems were particularly inconsistent with remorse. He almost appeared to be reveling in the events. On the night of November 20th, 2010, David was lured into the Belanglo State Forest, where Ivan Millet killed 7 backpackers in the early 90s, with the promise of smoking cannabis and drinking to celebrate his 17th birthday. He was joined by Millet and Klein, both 19 and both convicted of murder, and a third friend, Chase Day, who was not charged. When the teenagers arrived at the Southern Highlands Forest, David was tortured, tormented, and then murdered with a double axe by Millet. His body was buried in the forest in what Crown Prosecutor Lloyd Babb described as an adrenaline, fueled thrill kill. Before the killing, Millet reportedly rubbed his hands together and said, "We're going to Belanglo. Someone's going to die." During the recent sentencing hearings for Millet and Klein, Justice Matthews heard that the teenagers had made a mobile phone recording of the murder as a personal trophy of what they have done. Millet later bragged about his actions, telling friends that he was doing what my family does, and attempted to glorify the murder in a series of poems he wrote in jail, and later sent to his mother. What a sick fuck. David's mother and grandparents said Millet and Klein should be given life sentences by Justice Matthews, but the teenagers' barristers argued that their youth, lack of previous convictions, and early guilty pleas entitled them to reduced jail terms. Justice Matthews was also told during the sentencing hearing that Millet had recently made a number of expressions of remorse, including writing a letter apologising to David's family from the depths of my heart. Don't fucking believe it. The prosecution asked for the discount on sentence usually given to offenders who enter early guilty pleas to be waived in the case of Millet because of the threat he posed to the community. Justice Matthews indicated that a key question in determining the length of the jail sentences would be the extent of premeditation. The teenagers' lawyers said they went to the forest with the intention to hurt and to scare David, but not to kill him. This is particularly the case with Klein. This is a very unusual case in that the decision about the seriousness of the offence hinges very much on the question of premeditation, Justice Matthews said. A crucial element in Justice Matthews' decision was her finding out that the murder was premeditated, which she said put the killing into the worst category. If any additional support were required for the proposition that this was a premeditated killing on the part of Millet, it could be found in the poems he wrote in the custody. Some 9 months later, she said, not only did Millet describe himself in one of the poems as a cold-blooded killer, but the poem Your Last Day has all the hallmarks of a gloated reminiscence of the deliberate tormenting and killing of the deceased. In all circumstances, I have no doubt whatsoever that the killing of the deceased by the offender, Millet, was a deliberate premeditated one. Justice Matthews rejected the request from Millet's barrister for him to be kept in juvenile detention rather than an adult jail until he turned 21 to allow him to complete his HSC, ordering that he immediately be transferred to an old adult facility. In determining the length of the sentence, she also found that Millet was not entitled to the discount usually given to offenders who enter guilty pleas. Outside court, David's mother, Donna Locke, and one of his friends, folded a banner consisting of an Aboriginal flag and the words, "Rest in peace, David. May the 3 murderers rot in hell." The use of the word 3 was in reference to Millet, Klein, and apparently to Chase Day. "It will never be enough because David is gone," Miss Locke said. "He, Millet, can still come out and live some of his life, which is something David can never do. He shouldn't have been allowed to leave until he was cold and grey and in a body bag like my son, where he left in the forest. David's grandfather, David Ultraloni Sr. said, "I don't care about his rehabilitation. Hopefully by the time he leaves jail, he'll be past it." This case is just horrific, and there's actually not much on this case. I mean, what's weird is that he's the nephew of a serial killer. I mean, there's definitely some twisted genes. Oh no. Because that's a look at his uncle. So, Ivan Millet was best known as the backpacker murderer, convicted of 7 murders of backpackers in Australia. From the age of 17, Ivan Millet was in trouble with the police, but it didn't come close to the 7 murders that he would be convicted for committing in 1996. Millet became known as the backpacker murderer, after being found guilty of 7 gruesome murders in Australia's Belanglo State Forest. Millet was born in Guildford, Australia, on December 27th, 1944, one of 14 children. In an extended Yugoslavian immigrant family life was rural and insular, and the Millets kept to themselves, making reliable information about Millet's upbringing difficult to obtain. Interviews with his brother Boris after Millet's trial indicate that he exhibited psychopathic tendencies early on. Through other family members dispute this, Millet was described as a good-looking muscular boy who had a fascination for hunting and guns and took great care of his appearance. His parents were hard-working and strict. With 14 children to manage, discipline was difficult, and Millet and his brothers had a reputation for lawlessness in their neighbourhood. The family endured numerous police visits to their farm as their children grew older. From the age of 17, Millet was constantly in trouble with both the police and the courts on charges as varied as housebreaking, car thefts and armed robberies. In 1971, Millet was put on trial for the alleged rape of 2 female hitchhikers who testified that he had been armed with a knife during the attacks. He was acquitted on the rape charges. However, when the prosecution failed to make a convincing case against him, there has been much speculation about the true number of Millet's victims, given that he's always maintained his innocence. But the luckiest of them was certainly British backpacker Paul Onions, who was hitchhiking south from Sydney in search of work and was picked up by Millet on the 25th of January 1990. Millet was initially very friendly, introducing himself as Bill, but Onions found Millet's personal questions about his plans unnerving, and he became concerned for his safety when Millet began ranting and making racist and xenophobic remarks. When Millet pulled his car to the side of the road, Onions tried to get out, but Millet pulled out a revolver and told him to put on his seatbelt. Onions managed to bolt for safety, leaving his backpack, which contained all his possessions and passport. Despite Millet's threat that he would shoot him, he managed to flag down a passing car, which took him to the nearest police station so that he could report the incidents. He returned to Sydney to replace the missing passport and eventually returned to the United Kingdom, not yet aware of his narrow escape. The first of Millet's less fortunate victims was to be discovered were British backpackers Caroline Clark and Joanne Waters. They were found in an area of the Belanglo State Forest known as Executioner's Drop by orienteering enthusiasts who were out on their weekly run on September 19th, 1992. This location was not far from the area where the attack on Onions had occurred in 1990. Both girls had been missing since May of that year, when they had teamed up to look for work south of Sydney. Waters had been stabbed repeatedly, including one wound to her spine that it was believed might have paralysed her while the killer continued his vicious attack. The zip of her jeans had been undone. The top of the button was still fastened, as if she had been partially stripped and sexually assaulted, then buttoned up hastily after the attack. Her remains were too badly decomposed to actually establish whether a sexual attack had occurred. Clark, as well as being stabbed repeatedly, had been shot in the head 10 times. She also had a similar spine wound to Waters. 4 bullets that remained inside her skull were preserved for forensic analysis, and detectives were confident that they'd be able to use these to track the weapon responsible. A primitive brick fireplace had been constructed near their bodies, and cigarette butts and spent .22 caliber cartridge cases were also recovered from the scene. An extensive search of the surrounding area produced no more bodies at that time, and the possibility that the serial killer was on the loose, although speculated in the press, was denied by the police authorities. Despite the abundance of forensic evidence, police made little progress over the following weeks and sought the assistance of a forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Rod Milton. He concluded that the killer was in his mid-30s, had a history of aggression, was familiar with the surrounding terrain, and was motivated by the pleasure of inflicting pain. Furthermore, he did not believe that a serial killer was responsible, although it was possible that the killer might have an assistant. Police progress continued to be slow as all leads were painstakingly followed, including a thorough investigation of all suspicious disappearances over the previous decade. The discovery of the second set of bodies in October 1993 injected new life into the case that had become stale despite best investigative efforts. The badly decomposed remains were those of Australian nationals James Gibson and Deborah Everest, who had gone missing in 1989. Despite the environmental damage wrought on the clothing, Gibson's zipper was intact. It was open, but with the top button fastened in a similar manner to daughters. Post-mortem examinations again revealed paralysing spinal knife wounds inflicted in a similar manner to the earlier British victims. Crime scene similarities included a small fireplace built near their bodies, making the police more certain that they were dealing with the same killer. And Superintendent Clive Small was placed in overall charge of the investigation, setting up a large task force to track the progress of the investigations. A massive manual search of the extended Belanglo forest area was initiated, and it took almost a month before the next victim was found on November 1st. German national Simone Schmidl had been missing since January 1991, when she had been planning to hitchhike south from Sydney in search of work. The trademark fireplace and discarded 22 shells were close by. There was no doubt she had fallen victim to the same killer, showing the now familiar spinal injury. 3 days later, the extensive search yielded 2 final victims, German nationals, Adja and her boyfriend, Gabor, who had been missing since just after Christmas 1991. The boy's jeans had been unzipped, but with the button fastened, and he had been strangled, as well as shot numerous times. The recovered bullets were a perfect match to the previous crime scenes. The girl's body was missing its skull completely, which appeared to have been severed by a machete or a sword. Given the new bodies, Superintendent Small was forced to admit to the media that the police were looking for a serial killer, confirming what many had already believed: the wide range of methods employed by the killer, including beating, strangulation, shooting, stabbing and decapitation, as well as the sexual assault of both male and female victims, made it difficult to narrow down the suspect list. And police were also hampered by the sheer volume of calls from concerned citizens who swamped the task force with information. Various independent reports had led the police to develop suspicions about the Millet family, and in particular Ivan, but they had no firm evidence linking him to the crimes. The international media interest served its purpose. However, the case got a break when Onions, the only one of Millet's victims to escape, contacted Australian authorities in April 1994 with information about his 1990 attack. His account was further corroborated by an independent call from the woman who had rescued Onions and driven him to the police station. And police recognised quickly that if Onions could identify Millet as his attacker, then they could perhaps tie him to the other murders. Onions was flown out to Australia, where he identified Millet from a video lineup, giving police the excuse they needed to seek a warrant for the search of various Millet family properties, and a simultaneous raid was carried out in the early hours of May 22nd, 1994. Which revealed a huge amount of evidence linking Millet to the crimes, including personal effects of many of the victims, including clothing, sleeping bags and other camping equipment, as well as vast quantities of ammunition. They also found parts of disassembled weapons, including a 22 caliber rifle, a long curved cavalry sword suitable for the beheading of one of his victims, was found locked in a cupboard at the home of Millet's mother. Millet was arrested and taken into custody for questioning, where he was evasive and uncooperative. He He was initially charged with the attack on Onions, then subsequently with the 7 murders. Once ballistic evidence was matched to his weapons to the attack, he was remained in custody to await trial. He engaged the same lawyer who had represented him during his 1971 rape trial and acquittal, John Marsden, but fired him when he advised Millet to plead guilty. Millet's trial was set for June 1990, but the case was delayed by wrangles over legal aid, and finally went ahead in full glare of international publicity in March 1996. Millet was charged with the 7 murders as well as the attack on Onions and pleaded not guilty to all charges. Onions was the first prosecution witness, who was followed by testimony from family members and the victims, then followed details of the hundreds of exhibits and crime scene photos, as well as expert witness testimony. The prosecution case took 12 weeks to present. On July 27, 1996, following a 15-week trial, the jury returned 3 days of consideration, finding Millet guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment for the attack on Onions and 7 consecutive life sentences for each of the murders. When asked if he had any comment, Millet continued to protest his innocence. And in July 2001, his initial appeal against his sentence was denied. And then on Monday, May 13th, 2019, Millet was taken from Goulburn Supermax Prison to the Prince of Wales Hospital in Sydney, where he underwent tests for lumps found in his throat and stomach. It is believed he was diagnosed with terminal esophagus cancer. He died on October 27, 2019 at the hospital wing at the Long Bay Correctional Centre. Wow. This is such a mind-blowing case. I know we were looking at Matthew's case, but his uncle is just as twisted. There's definitely something wrong in the genes right there. But yes, so we got 2 cases for the price of one. For the price of one suggestion. It was really interesting looking into these cases. So messed up. I'm glad he was caught. And he died in prison. So there was justice. Although slow, but there was justice. But yes, I hope you found this video to be super relaxing, and I shall see you guys in my next video. Sweet dreams.